Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our live session today. My name is Larissa, and I'm an event planner at the Reactor. I'm joining you today from São Paulo in Brazil. Before we start, I have some housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. This session is being recorded and will be available to view on demand here on the Reactor YouTube channel within 48 hours. Keep an eye on the chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer. I will now turn it over to our speaker for today. So, hello, Johan.
Hello. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the first of 11 sessions that we got planned around the Azure Developer Certification. These sessions do not really build on one another, but they've taken the course and we've split the course up into the different learning paths, and we're doing a session on each of these learning paths. So it's only 1 hour, which means we don't have a lot of time. So we cannot get to everything, but I'll at least give you a bunch of nice tips and at least some overview of what these services and technologies look like. We're doing this as part of a Reactor series. So go and check out the other sessions as part of these series. We've got one for each of the learning paths that are actually part of the course. On top of that, what I've done here at the bottom, you'll see, and I'm sure that we can also share the link around this. If you go to github.com/sayedimac/course content, we'll share this on the chat in a few minutes. This is essentially going to take you through to a repository that I use to help my students, essentially. So let me just quickly crack it open here. Should not have to authenticate there. I will just go here. There we go. This is going to work. So in this repository, the repository that I'm referring to over here, in this repository, you will see that I've got all sorts of tips and tricks, PowerShell scripts and these sort of things to help with these courses. I train a variety of different courses. If you click on the PowerShell folder or go to the PowerShell folder, you will see that I've got essentially a AZ-104. This is the Azure Administrator course. AZ-204, this is the Azure Developer course. And what I've done here is I've basically given you all the PowerShell and CLI scripts addressing everything possible from the course. You'll get questions in the exam on this, so make sure that you've at least gone through this once or maybe twice or so on. So before I get going, take note of these course links. They will definitely help you, especially when you start prepping. The other link I want to show to you is a very common link if you know our course codes. If I go to akka.ms/ and you can see there's AZ400 labs. That's our DevOps course. If I go AZ204 labs, it'll basically take you to a GitHub repo. Well, not to the repo itself. You can see in here, we've basically got all the individual instructions. So build a web application, right? And there's the instructions for essentially this first part of the course. All right, so you're more than welcome to go and dig around on some of these links. Of course, this hands-on labs here that you see is effectively going to require that you bring your own subscription. So just be mindful of that. Great stuff. So further to this, what I'd like to do is just maybe give us a brief introduction or agenda that we're going to be talking about. I'm planning to introduce app services and app service plans in one go and also talk about the scaling. You will see the course material talks about introduction, but it also talks about scalability of these. I'm going to roll all of that into one. Then we'll touch a little bit on the configuration, and then we'll touch a little bit on deployment slots. Now, I need to make it clear, it's impossible for me to cover in 1 hour that essentially in the 4 or 5 day course, we are covering in about 6 hours. So I'm going to at least leave you with the concepts here, show you a couple of demos, give you some tips and tricks, and then it's up to you to go and dig a little bit deeper and get some of that additional information. So without any further ado here, I'm going to open up my Encoder whiteboard here, and I want you to think of app services as there's really 2 resources in Azure that we're referring to when we're talking about app services. And we're talking about, definitely not the right color, is it? We're talking about, in fact, I'll use brown for this. We're talking about an app service plan. And the plan is essentially where your cost lies. So this is going to determine what you're going to be paying for the plan. A plan is also based, the features that you get as part of the app service will be based on the type of plan that you've selected. So there are different types of plans. Essentially, changing the plan, any changes that you might be making on the plan, if you're changing the plan, what you are basically doing is you are either scaling up or you are scaling down. Right? So that's effectively what the plan is. So what you do is you create a plan, and once you've got your plan, you start plugging in your applications into the plan. Right? So there's maybe application 1, application 2, application 3, application 4. In other words, your plan is more like your infrastructure. And you could see it as a set of virtual machines, but it's not really virtual machines, and you don't have that level of access and flexibility that you might have with virtual machines. Let's quickly create a plan. I actually already have a plan, but I'm going to show you what it'll look like if I created a plan. If I get into the Azure portal here and I search for app service, you will see that there's a couple of options. There's an app service environment. Let me just bump my font slightly. There's an app service environment here, but there's also an app service. But if I type the word plans, you'll also see that there's an app service plan. So I've got a couple already, and you'll see that the plans are basically based on Linux or Windows for that matter. And further to this, if I just go to my downloads here. 1 second. I do want to just quickly install something, otherwise I'm going to struggle here. It should just take a second. You'll see in a minute why I want to do this. There we go. So you will see that these plans are based on an operating system, and the apps are inherently also linked to an operating system. So when you want to run on a Windows machine, you will choose a plan that's running Windows. If you want to run on a Linux platform, you'll choose a plan that runs on Linux. So I'm going to click on the create button here. First things first, I need to choose my subscription. I'm going to go with possibly an existing resource group. The resource group doesn't matter too much in this context. There you can see I can go with a JAS 204 plan for that matter, and you can see that I can choose between having either a Linux or a Windows plan. Right? So if I choose, for example, Linux, and I scroll down and I select UK South, whenever I'm creating an app service later on, if I'm selecting the same region and selecting the same operating system, this plan will become available for me to deploy my app on. All right, so we'll get back to that a bit later on. You can see there that I can get you to choose between these different plans. And this is what I meant by changing the plan is effectively scaling up or down, because you'll notice that each of these plans have got X amount of hardware. Each of these plans also has some scale. There's a SLA that might be different between them, X amount of storage, CPU, RAM, etc. So when I'm changing the plan, I'm either scaling the service up or I'm scaling the service down. Take note though, this is not something that you want to be doing automatically. We will get to automatic scaling in a few minutes. So you can see here what I might be selecting is I might be selecting the premium V3 plan, and you will see that this will come with one CPU, 4 gigs of RAM. That might not be sufficient, and also comes with 250 gigs of storage. Now, something you will notice is that we've got something called a scaled instance here. And I want you to notice that the cost per month is based on one of those instances. Okay, so strictly speaking, if I head back to Encoder here, what this means is if I'm creating a plan, this plan has got some cost associated with it. It's got some features, whatever the case, it's got some storage. And effectively, as I provision this plan and as I start provisioning apps on this plan, the plan might require to scale. And what we mean by instances is we mean this app service plan that I'm creating is in actual fact, it could be a cluster of servers. Now you'll notice if I head back in here, you will see scale instances for the free plan. You will see it doesn't have any scale instances. So this will typically just have one single instance, and it's just one host that's running that application. If that host is affected or experiences some downtime, your application is affected. Now you will see that the SLA we give with that, there's no SLA with that, right? The minute we choose one of the other plans, like even the basic plan has got 3 instances. And this effectively means that there can be 3 hosts, each running one instance of your application. And that means that we've got a load balancer in front of us. In actual fact, if I can maybe draw out a couple of plans here for you just for a second. And I do want to do that again. I'm going to add this a few times, to be honest. We've got a couple of types of plans. The one is called a shared plan. The other one is called a dedicated plan. Typos. And the other one is called an isolated plan. And what we really mean by this is the following. If I'm using the shared plan, this host and the virtual network that it's connected to is shared with your applications and your application network traffic, but it's also shared with other customers' applications and their network traffic, right? If I'm choosing one of the other plans, like for example, the dedicated plan, slightly different, still got the hosts or the individual host, depending on the plan type you got. With this, we only have basic and upwards. And you can see that in this case, I'm only going to be running my applications on this dedicated plan. However, the virtual network infrastructure that's used behind the scenes is still actually shared by other customers. Doesn't mean that you can see their traffic, doesn't mean that you can access their applications. All it means is when we provision these hosts, that network infrastructure is essentially shared between those those instances. And you can probably see where I'm going here with the last one. Of course, if you were using the isolated plan, and this is a different plan altogether, this is called an app service environment, right? And the app service environment, as you can imagine, is running only your applications, but the virtual network infrastructure that supports it is also only dedicated to your applications and their network traffic. So this is a completely different service altogether. you will actually need to provision or have some virtual networks provisioned alongside that. So in this case, for this isolated environment, you will actually in Azure see some of that infrastructure. You'll see the virtual network, the subnet, and actually what sits on top of that. Okay, so what we said is for that shared plan, we just get one instance. However, for most of the other plans, what we're actually getting is a little cluster. Okay, and that's why my costing says per month. So if I'm scaling to 3 instances, that'll be 3 times 13 US dollars in this case. If I'm scaling to 30 instances on this plan, the premium plan, we're talking about 30 times 151. So as your cluster scales out, that is the cost that you will essentially on average pay per month for those services. All right, so that's something to keep in mind. I'm not going to actually go and provision one of these. You will also see that we've got a feature view here. And in the feature view, it's effectively going to tell me what features are available for these different plans. Now, once again, they can be quite intense in the exams. They can expect for you to know some of these things. But keep in mind, our exams does give you access to the Microsoft Learn portal. So you will have access to the Microsoft Learn search in the exam, and you can go and search for this. My recommendation usually for my students and for my learners is that you stop using Bing or Google search when it comes to Microsoft content and material. If you're prepping for the exam, use the Microsoft Learn search, because that will be available in the exam for you to use, right? So the more well-versed you are with that, the better. You will also see that based on the plan type, I can do things like X amount of daily backups. You can see some of them have got staging slots. Some of these are zone redundant. Some of them have got VNet integration. It just depends what you're trying to achieve. Now, I always say that we want to scale our app services automatically, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to scale them up or down automatically, right? So we want to scale them horizontally, add instances to the cluster, remove instances from the cluster for that matter, but we don't want to run scripts that changes this pricing plan. I'll tell you why. If you look at the pricing sort of a margin between the free plan and this basic plan, you're talking about what's that, more or less times 5 the cost. So your cost, if you had to do this automatically, will jump up like this and will suddenly jump up like that, right? So if you end up automatically scaling these app service plans up and down, your costs are going to be completely unpredictable. What you want to do is you want to scale in and out, because scaling in and out just adds another instance into the cluster, and your cost becomes a lot more predictable and a lot more consistent, because every time you add an instance to the cluster, it's just that cost that essentially gets added every single time. Whereas if you scale the plan automatically, we don't have actually features to do that, you'll have to do that yourself, then you can see that you can actually, and this is what you're trying to avoid, you can go from $150 per instance per month. And if I just maybe scroll down a little bit, you can see there is a plan, $2,424 per month per instance, folks. So if you've got 30 instances of that, you're going to come up with quite a hefty price tag for scaling the cluster like that, right? You don't want to scale up and down automatically. You want to scale in and out automatically. All right, so there you can see I can choose my plan, and I also can select whether I want zone redundancy enabled. That's actually all there is to the plan. Nothing about .NET or the frameworks you might be using. Once you've got the plan, you can see there that I've got a couple of plans here. Among them, there's one plan. And you can see if I go to my settings and I click on app, it'll show me that I've currently got two apps in there. The one is an app and the other one is a slot. Okay, so my plan has also got some storage allocated to it. This one has got 50 gigabytes available. And then you can also see that there's my scale up options where I can change my plan. And there's the scale out options. If I just zoom in on this a little bit, this is the scale up is changing the hardware. In other words, this will affect the price of the individual instance. This one here is really just scaling the instances. In other words, if this is a cluster, then it'll basically add or remove instances into the cluster. Predictable costing. Scaling the top part or up and down automatically, very unpredictable costing. All right, so you'll notice that if I click on scale out here, it'll give me a couple of options. Right there you can see there's a manual scale. So manual scale, I can scale up to 10, and what Microsoft will do is we will always try to give you 10 instances in your cluster behind the load balancer, right? However, you can also see that I've got a rule-based scaling here. And if I hit the configure button, it's going to basically prompt me to do auto scaling. And you can see there that I can still go and specify, scale based on a metric. I can still specify a minimum and a maximum number of instances. But if I click on scale on a metric and add rules, what I can do here is I can effectively specify that based on, in this case, CPU percentage. If it's greater than 70% for longer than 10 minutes, I want to increase that count by 1. And this, of course, is, as you can see there, this is a scale out rule. So whenever the CPU is over 70%, increase the count by 1. Of course, when you are scaling in or out, you also need to scale in, and vice versa. If you're scaling in, you need to scale out. Otherwise, it's just going to keep on scaling out. So what I'll typically do here is I'll add another rule, maybe also CPU percentage, and then just specify if it's less than something like 30%, then decrease the count by 1. And very simply put here, I've now added some auto scale rules that will scale this app service plan of mine based at this point in time on just the CPU percentage. You might also have things like the HTTP queue length, the disk queue length, and whatever other parameters might make sense. I also want to point out that I can actually go and add some additional scale conditions here. In other words, these scale conditions could be different from my scale rules that I had earlier. For example, we might know that it's Black Friday from today. So from yesterday or from whatever day, from next week, the 25th, to say the 28th or whatever the case is, we want to scale to 20 instances, for example. And what our Azure Monitor service will do is it'll monitor this and it'll avoid server flapping. So whenever we think we need to create a new instance, we will make sure that we will not have to destroy that instance in a few seconds, and we won't keep adding and removing instances from the cluster constantly. We will try to sort of even it out so that you always get what you want. You can also see there that I can also scale based on specific days. So what the app service plan will do is it'll effectively monitor all these rules, and it'll try to optimize the cluster so that you get whatever you need in terms of performance. Now I've just clicked on the JSON button here at the top. I've noticed in the exam they love asking questions like this. There you can see there's my profile, minimum, maximum, default, and you can see there, X amount of days, whatever. towards the bottom here, you can see there's my metric trigger. So they might in the exam actually show you a snippet of JSON for the auto scale, and they might ask you, what is this auto scale doing? So I would suggest that you configure these in the labs, and then you go and take a look at this JSON as opposed to just looking at the actual graphical configuration, right? I think that's actually a pretty good exam tip. All right, so if I can quickly just pop back here onto my slides. So we've introduced app services. We haven't actually introduced app services. We introduced app service plans. Remember, the apps, the plan has got a one-to-many relationship with apps. And I can plug in multiple applications onto the plan if I choose to do that. Okay, that's the first thing. If I make any changes that affects the plan, it'll obviously affect all the apps that are running on the plan. Folks, I like to think of this in terms of an analogy. I like to think of this of a school as a school bus. An app service plan is like a school bus, and you're never going to buy one school bus for each of the children, right? Each child has a seat on the bus, and just like that, if you purchase an app service plan, then Microsoft will allow you to start adding kids onto the bus. They will allow you to start adding apps onto the app service plan, and that's really what we're talking about. Quick exam tip here. I'm about halfway with my session here. Quick exam tip. Make sure that you can access the tier settings from Microsoft Learn. If I go to just learn.microsoft.com here, app service plan. There we go. Pricing tiers. Right, and you can see there's my environment. So that's not at all what I wanted. So I'm just going to do another option here. In fact, I think if you give me just a second, I might be able to, there should actually be a link on the Azure portal for this. I'll give it just a second to load. Great, the app service plan. There's the pricing tiers. It's actually easier to get here from here. Sorry about that. You can see there towards the bottom, app service free plan, some options, and the limitations. There you can see the basic plan, some of the options, amount of cores, and then you can see there's the premium plan and whatever is associated with that. And then towards the bottom, you will also see the amount of storage. There is a cap on the storage. And if you don't extend your storage with an Azure storage account, this is actually a hard limit. So if your marketing department says to you on a Friday, hey, we're plugging in our new web application on Monday, we're going live with that, we've added the videos, it's about a 1 terabyte site size here, you're going to probably exceed this storage limit, but you can bring some additional Azure storage as well. And as long as your path in your content references that correctly, it should actually be all good. Right, so try to make sure that you can at least get to this if you're in the exam. They love asking questions around these sort of things in our exams. And the reason for that is they want to know if you know, for example, that, hey, the free plan doesn't have more than one instance. It's just got that single instance, right? So the features are based on the plan that you select. We've touched on the scaling. We can do vertical scaling. This should be manual. And even though you can automate that with scripts and things like that, that's when you get that unpredictable costing, because suddenly your instance is going from $63 per month, it's going to $2,300 per month. So that's not something you want to scale automatically. What you want to do is you want to monitor your application services over time. And if you're constantly running into the maximum instances. If you're constantly flatlining the CPU, then bump up the plan to a bigger plan that's going to give you a little bit more iron under the hood for those applications. Horizontal scaling, and this is something that we can do automatically. Right? Auto scale configuration, I touched on that already. Make sure that you've looked at the JSON for that, just on that point. Okay, so first things first here, I've created my app service plan, and you will see that I can now go and scale this plan based on whatever rules I want to be adding. I'm going to quickly scale back on a metric so that my scaling is actually set up here, and then I'm going to add another rule here for less than. I actually thought I did do this earlier. I'm going to decrease the count by 1. So there's my scale in, scale out rules. I'm just going to hit the save button there. Okay, so what we've spoken about now quite comprehensively, we spoke about these different plans. We saw that the plan has essentially got some storage allocated to it, and your application code is always deployed to the storage. It's actually a separate file share. It's not deployed to the server itself. On top of that, we've also got a load balancer in front of this. So there's actually a load balancer that is taking the request from that's coming into the application service, and it's distributing the load over that cluster that you've got as part of your plan. And it's actually an Azure load balancer that's doing that. You don't have access to configure the load balancer. There's no option like that. It's completely transparent to you, right? Hence, this is one of our more popular PaaS services that we've got. So now what we're ready to do is we are actually ready to start creating our app. Now I want you to remember that I've got my plan, and now I'm ready to deploy my actual application. All right, let's head back in here. I'm going to go back to the Azure portal. I'm going to go for app services, and you'll see I've already got a couple of app services. I'm going to click on the create button. This is just going to take a few seconds. I'm going to go for that same test resource group I had earlier. I'm going to call this one Jazz 204. Let's call it Node, all right? Because I'm planning to deploy a Node application on there. The first app I deployed was actually a .NET application. So there we go. There you can see things like Java, for example. If I choose Java, it's actually prompting me for a web server stack. You want to use JBoss, right? You want to use Apache Tomcat or something like that. Even on earlier versions of Java, you can see the embedded server. There's there's JBoss and Tomcat and a couple of other options. So it largely depends on what runtime stack you're selecting. You can see there's all .NET flavors. There's Java. If I wanted a Node application, then I can typically deploy a Node application on this service as well. So I'm going to head over to UK South, and you should see that I've already got an app service plan there. App service plan, Jazz eShop on web. If I select Windows, it might actually show me a Windows plan. There we go. There's a Windows plan, right? So I've already got a Windows plan, and what I'm doing now is I'm plugging my web application onto that app service plan. I'll hit the database. There's maybe some deployment configuration. I'll talk about this later on. There you can see some networking options, also more on that later on. And then lastly, monitoring whether I want to be able to use app services insights for this. I'm going to click on the create button. It's probably disabled because of the plan I'm using. But essentially what I'm doing here is I'm now also deploying a Node application to that application service plan of mine. So if I head back to my plans, there you can see there's that test plan that I've got. And if I click on apps, there's my existing .NET application. Both of those are .NET. And if I just keep refreshing here, within a couple of seconds, you will actually see, in fact, I'm going to hit the proper refresh. Then you'll see now this application service plan of mine is running those two .NET applications, but it's, well, sorry, not that one. Those two .NET applications, this one's a slot, more on that later, but it's also running this Node application of mine. So Microsoft will essentially take care of deploying that frameworks and those options onto these hosts on your behalf. You don't have to do that, right? So I'm going to head over to this Node application quickly. I will just briefly touch on some of the configuration options we've got in here. And if I scroll down, you will see immediately if I go for app service plan, if I go for settings, anything like this, my scale up, remember, this is actually changing the app service plan. My scale out, this is also changing the app service plan. All right, so these settings affect the plan, not the individual app. It will affect all the apps. Scrolling a little bit more to the top here, I want you to notice that I've got some environmental variables. Now, we haven't spoken about slots yet, but we will get to slots in a minute. This is essentially setting up environmental variables that my application might require to run. For example, database connection strings, like things like this. But you can also see I've got connection strings here for more secure types of environmental variables that we might want to be leveraging. I'm going to go for app settings here, and you will see that our Node version is actually configured as an environmental variable setting. All right. I can now go and hit the add button here, and I can go and add something like my database connection string. And, this might be the dbcon from Node app. I'm not going to be able to show this to you, but you can see there towards the bottom, it's prompting me for a deployment slot setting. More on this later on, but I'm basically configuring the scope of the configuration setting at this point. Either it's going to apply to the app and all its slots, or it's going to be different on my slots. We'll talk about slots in a minute. So I'll click on apply here just for now. If I, for example, scroll down and look at my configuration there, let me just save that. If I scroll down and look at my configuration, yes, I think it can work. Then there you can see my stack is Node. So if we decide to rebuild this application using .NET now, all I have to do is just select .NET, choose the flavor and version of .NET, and hit the save button. Microsoft will then remove Node.js from the instances, and it'll redeploy .NET 9 on there if you wanted to do something like that. You can also see here that basic SCM and FTP authentication by default is disabled on this environment. So that's something to just be mindful of. Further to this, I've got my environmental variables. I've got some configuration here that I've just alluded to. And you will see that under configuration, the general settings, default documents, path mappings, and error pages, two of these two over here, are quite specific to Windows, right? You're not going to have those on Linux for some reason. We've also got the concept of authentication here. I'm not going to save that. So authentication is an interesting one. You might also get some questions in the exam on this. And basically what we do is if you've plugged your application onto the plan now, and you enable authentication like that setting that I was just showing you, what we will do is we will essentially wrap your application with an authentication layer. And that authentication layer means if your user is navigating to this application URL, we will check to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, we will prompt the user with all of the authentication provider options that you've configured for the app service. The user will choose, I want to log in using Gmail, for example. They will go and be redirected to Gmail. They will authenticate, and then they will get access to the application here. That means that you don't have to tweak and make changes to your application in order to do authentication on app services. No code changes required for this. However, if you wanted your application to read some of those values from the authentication, the token that you might have got, refresh tokens and things like that, we do make those tokens and the credentials that you've got from authentication, we do make those credentials and those tokens available to you in your application if you wanted to read them and do something like a token refresh, something similar to that. All right, so right now, what I've got is I've got two applications. Let me just choose the brown option here. I've got two applications, right? The one is a .NET application, and the other one is a Node application, and both of those are running on this application service plan of mine, all right? And the scaling settings will apply to both the .NET and the Node application. So let's just quickly touch on the slides on this. I've got about 10 minutes left here, so I think I'm making good time. Now, you will see there, I've touched a little bit on the authentication. We've touched also a little bit on those environmental variables. And then you can see we've also got a secure configuration management component. That means that for example, environmental variables don't have to be stored in the app service. I can actually let my app service reference the key vault, and the key vault then brings back the secret or the database connection to the app service. And the way to do that, folks, is you'll notice that if I go for my environmental variables here, I can add a new environmental variable. And if I pop back in here, and let me just go to my key vault, that's all I have to do, right? You can see that this is actually a key vault reference that I'm adding here, and that allows me to store my secrets and database connection strings and other keys that I need in the Azure Key Vault. And this app service will then retrieve that value from the Key Vault if it has the correct permissions to do that. So more on this later on in the course when we get to our authentication and authorization learning path. All right, so we spoke about environmental variables, secure configuration. There's also things like certificates, custom DNS. You will have to go and look at a couple of these options. You'll notice that there's my authentication. I can add one or more of these identity providers and provide authentication wrapper around my app service. There's things like custom domains, and you'll notice that if I choose any other type of domain, www.news.com, for example, you'll notice that it actually allows me to add those custom domains with a CNAME or a text entry, right? Great exam question if you ask me, even though it feels a little bit sort of, gosh, will they really ask that level of detail in the exam? And they will. Think of this quickly, certificates. We touched on certificates. Certificates, of course, is going to be when you want to bring your own custom domain and do that SSL termination there. We will cater for that. You will get one domain with your app service, a Microsoft domain. Custom domains you'll have to add, and then obviously also add your custom certificates. Now, what I would expect in the exam nowadays is for them to ask you about certificates. How do you add a certificate to the app service? Maybe using something like PowerShell or the CLI commands. So when you're prepping for the exam, I would recommend that you prep with PowerShell, prep with CLI across all the different learning paths, as opposed to just focusing on one specific learning path. There are things like web jobs. If you wanted to run a script to clean up folders, add a folder, something like that in your app service, we can do that. And then further towards the bottom here, you will see that there's some options, right? I've got some extensions that I might want to add. If you wanted to do some app instrumentation using something like Datadog, we can use these extensions and we can effectively add some of those third-party or additional Microsoft components onto the app service for you to be leveraging, right? You want to use Python, there's Node, Datadog, whatever you might want to be adding there. So if I pop back onto my slide deck here, we've looked at the configuration at a high level. The last thing for us to touch on is deployment slots. And deployment slots is the interesting one because we use this quite effectively in our DevOps course for addressing different deployment patterns. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to this web app of mine, right? Remember, I created this node application. This node application will show you that currently there are no slots. Okay, I've just created this node app. It's brand new. There aren't any slots. That's actually a bit of a lie. There is a slot. There is what is known as the production slot. It's there, you just cannot see it. Let me show you what I mean with that. If I click on add slot here, firstly, it's going to prompt me for a name. I can go and say UAT, just as an example. Doesn't have to be an environment, folks. And I can also go and clone some of the configuration settings for one of my existing slots. I'll click on the add button here. This will just take a few seconds. And you will now see 2 slots on this app service, because the default, whenever I create an app service, it actually creates a default slot for you, a production slot. That production slot will have its own URLs, some of its own settings. And I want you to notice that earlier, there we go, there's my UAT in my production slot. And I want you to remember earlier, when I added some environmental variables, I could actually specify whether they should be scoped at the slot setting or at the entire application setting. So this is actually quite easy to come to grips with. Whenever your plan allows for it and your plan is good on slots, what you can do, and you'll see that this plan that I've got can add up to 20 different slots. So what that means is I might go and add a slot for UAT for my app service, but I can also possibly go and add a test or a dev slot. And the idea with these slots is that you use them for different deployment patterns. For example, I can give this URL to my testers to test this URL. I can give this UAT URL to my UAT testers to go and test that. And eventually, when we are happy with the quality of whatever is in test, what we will end up doing is we will end up swapping whatever is in test with UAT. And then if we're happy with what is in UAT, we will end up swapping UAT with our production application slot. All right. And that allows me to take my application from its source code, wherever that might be, and to be feeding it in here to my different slots. We first test here, and if it means that you're trying to do something like blue-green deployments, you might just have 2 slots and continuously toggle between them. If you wanted to do something like A/B testing, right, we've got an option to route. We've got an option to route a percentage of traffic to the UAT slot or whatever the slot is called. So in this case here, the application, if I go to the production one, if I go to the production URL, 50% of the users are actually going to access the UAT application. So this is actually, this is a lot like A/B testing, where I've got 2 versions of my application, but it's also a little bit like dark launching, right? So incremental exposure. So I might start with a 10% of my users are going to be using the new version. Eventually, we're going to bump it up to 20%. Eventually 30, 40, 50, 60, eventually 90%. That means our production users, 90% of them are actually using the UAT environment. And that means that we can hit the swap button. And if I do a swap, the load balancer will start draining out the requests on UAT, start draining out the requests on production, and it'll start redirecting this traffic. This means that swapping slots also gives me very close to a 0 downtime deployment pattern. And I think if I'm going to swap, no, I'm not going to swap these slots now, but if I go to my UAT slot, this is not available on the production slot, but if I scroll on my UAT slot all the way to the bottom, not all the way, but more or less all the way, you can see that we've got something called auto swap enabled. And what that means is, if I go back to my diagram here, if I've got my production slot and I've got, like a staging slot, the name in this case doesn't have to be UAT, it actually doesn't matter. What it means is if I deploy my code onto the staging environment, what we will do is we will warm up the application, and by default, the minute we're getting a response from the root of that URL, what we will do is we will auto swap out these different slots. So that means that all you want to do is just get your application into the slot. We will warm it up. Once it's warmed up, we will automatically swap out with production. Zero downtime deployment, this swapping capability. And then the last thing you might be asking is, gosh, well, Johan, if you've got application deployment slots and my user is on production, and in production, they're actually being routed to the UAT application, what does that mean for my environment variables, right? Of course, in that case, your environment variables are going to be consistent. You're not going to have a production slot with a production connection string in a database and a UAT database separate from that and mix the traffic between the two, because your production traffic is now going to the UAT database. So in those cases, I will not configure those slots for the configuration setting. You will leave it, and then all the slots will have the same database connection string, for example. Each of these slots get their own URL and configuration, and that is a great question in the exam. I had this question when I was when I did this some time ago already. There are certain fields that are swapped and certain fields that are not swapped. So if I go and just do a search on that, Azure deployment slots, swapped, not swapped, you can see there, somewhere in the middle, there's a nice little table for me. There we go. Steps for making a slot unswappable. When you swap slots, these settings are swapped. And you can imagine things like public certificates, right? Based on the URL name, things like this, certain settings are swapped, certain settings are not swapped, right? Keep in mind that you don't have access to the Bing search in the exam. And other than that, if I wanted to override that setting, we can also, there's a parameter that I can pass in the URL that will allow me to override going to UAT or going to production. So if I say self and the URL is for production, then I will go to URL. If I say UAT and the URL is for UAT, then I will navigate to the UAT. So you can override that. And that's actually how some of our customers give their customers the option to say, try the new version. Try the new version. You don't like it, go back to the old version. You can override the version with a parameter in the URL. And that, folks, brings me to the end of this brief introduction. I hope I've given you a couple of good tips. We spoke about the importance of app services. This is likely going to be your first stop when you get to migrating some of your workloads to the cloud. But some of the concepts for you to go and think about and maybe go dig a bit deeper in that material is make sure you understand the relationship between app service plans and apps and the slots for that matter as well. Check out the scaling options. Look at that JSON typo there, configuration, and then the deployment slots. We spoke about all of these. And then my last suggestion will be that you work through the hands-on labs and get some hands-on practical with regards to this. The hands-on labs for this will provision a backend API, and the backend API will connect to a storage account. And then there's going to be a front-end web application, and the web application connects to the API. And both of these run on the same app service plan, the front-end application as well as the back-end API application. And that's that from my side. I want to see, maybe there's a bunch of questions.
Hey, we have a few questions. The first question we received is from Jonathan. His question is, does this change when we introduce private endpoints?
I'm not sure. It's a little bit difficult for me. It's a little bit difficult for me to get context around that. I'm not 100% sure what you were referring to, but I do want to just quickly address that. If I go into my app service, right, you will notice that if I click on networking here, that I can configure two things. I can configure inbound. In other words, where can I access this from? And then the second one, outbound configuration, what can it access? All right. So when I'm binding my application to a virtual network, it depends largely whether you're bounding it in from incoming traffic or from outbound traffic, right? In my case, I didn't bind it to any virtual network, and that's why I can access the application from the internet. I'm not sure. I'm happy to take that offline. You could probably also reach me at akka.ms/Johan. That'll link directly to my LinkedIn profile. So if I don't get to answer your question here properly, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll see if I can answer it there. So sorry about that, Jonathan. I didn't have a lot of context as to when you were asking that question, so apologies.
John, he elaborated that that was around networking.
I think I've outlined that pretty comprehensively, right? The networking is either configuring and limiting the inbound traffic, or you can also limit it to the outbound traffic. So I hope that I've answered that question. All right.
Awesome. And the next question we had was also from Jonathan. He asked if do slots increase your instance count? It was about 10 minutes ago.
Oh no. So if I can just quickly draw that out, the instance count, right, is essentially the size of your cluster. So when I create an application on this, on this application in Insights, or on this app service plan rather, then what's going to happen is we will deploy an instance of your application to each of the instances. But if I create a slot, that slot will also be available on all those instances. Right? There are ways around that, but by default, your application, your production slot, and your other slots are available on all the instances. I hope that answers the question. And it's also based on the pricing plan theory, if that makes sense. I hope I answered the question there.
Please, Jonathan, send us in the chat if your questions were answered. And thank you, Johan. I believe that was all the questions we had for today.
Okay, perfect. Well, folks, you've got my contact details. If you need any additional questions, I'm more than happy to field them. Get cracking with those labs, and then we'll see you next week for the second session, where we'll talk about functions, Azure functions. So thanks for joining the call. I hope you learned a bunch of things, even if it's just a good introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you for your content today. And to you that's watching us today, please take a moment to share your opinion. We value your feedback. There's a QR code in the screen, so you can scan it or send us your feedback and the link that I just posted in the chat. And we'll see you on the next one.